So nearly 80,000 forest fires have been detected in Brazil since the beginning of the year, just over a half of them in the Amazon basin. Now, the G7 summit has come and gone and committed to give $20 million to send firefighting planes to tackle the blazes. Now, the Amazon Watch Program Director, Christian Poirier, joins us now from Oakland, California. Very good evening to you, Mr. Poirier. Thanks for your time. Well, obviously, with the commitment of $20 million, is that near enough to deal with this crisis?
Absolutely not. It's a positive step. I believe that we need to see increasing international cooperation in support of efforts to extinguish these absolutely catastrophic fires in the Brazilian Amazon. $20 million is really a drop in the bucket, given the enormity of this crisis.
Yeah. Talk to us a bit about this crisis, the extent of it. You describe it as catastrophic. Paint a picture for us of exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about 80,000 forest fires here and the repercussions of this.
These fires are unprecedented in scale. They are stretching across vast swaths of the Brazilian Amazon, but also in Bolivia and Peru as well. Yeah. And we're seeing this year an 84% increase over last year's burning season, which is already pretty bad. But this year, it's on a scale it's very difficult to comprehend because the Amazon is on continental scales. So we're seeing vast areas of fire forest going up in flames, the extinguishing of or the destruction of many people's homes, of course, the destruction of untold species because of the biodiversity. 10% of the world's biodiversity is in the Amazon. Yeah. The emission of massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the global atmosphere, which is driving a runaway climate change. And of course, the destruction of the very forest that we need to really stave against the worst impacts of climate change. So it's a manifold number of issues that are converging here, not to mention the wanton environmental mismanagement of the Jair Bolsonaro regime, which gave birth to this crisis on a global scale.
Yeah, I want to talk about that mismanagement. Who's responsible for that? And you're obviously saying that the international community should take a shared responsibility for the fires. We heard a lot of tough talk as well. The G7 leaders declaring the fires an international crisis, but surely an immediate and long-term response is required well after the headlines.
Absolutely. This is unfortunately going to shift from the world's attention as the fires continue to rage on. And I think that French President Emmanuel Macron did an excellent job in raising the profile of this internationally and calling on Brazil to do what it needs to do to put out these fires. And not only put out these fires, but to live up to its duty to protect the Amazon forest on behalf of all of humanity, to protect the human rights of the indigenous communities that live there, of many other peoples who live there who are being impacted. And so we really need to see an increasing push internationally to hold Brazil accountable today. This is not just about money. This is about markets. Yeah. If Brazil's regime today is not understanding its responsibility and its for example, what's happening with the rollbacks on human rights and the environmental protection, this is Jair Bolsonaro's responsibility. His environmental minister, so-called environmental minister, Ricardo Salles, is enacting these draconian rollbacks that have led to the fires. His entire regime is beholden to Brazil's agribusiness sector, which is really what's been pushing for these environmental human rights rollbacks that have led to the fires. In fact, the actors within this within agribusiness, particularly ranchers, are studying the fires. So we need to see the very consumers of the products coming out of the Amazon, beef, timber, soy, holding Brazil accountable, that we will no longer stand by business as usual, given the results of the markets that are driving this destruction.
Yeah. Well, here in South Africa, we heard about some hot-worded statements with the Brazilian president, of course, Jair Bolsonaro, suggesting that NGOs could be starting the fires to embarrass him. Let me get your response to that.
This regime has absolutely no credibility, and Jair Bolsonaro is a pathological liar. We cannot take him at face value. We need to understand that this man will do anything to defer responsibility, to shift responsibility away from his true intention, which is to wipe away decades of hard-fought environmental and human rights protections that keep the Amazon standing, and trying to shift the blame to the very organizations that are doing the work on the ground with local communities to defend the Amazon on behalf of us all.
Does he not see that? Does he see this as a stumbling block, in your view, to economic growth? Or what is the reasons for President Bolsonaro's seemingly anti-environmental rhetoric, which certainly doesn't seem to be helping your cause?
Absolutely. Bolsonaro has said on many occasions that he sees the Amazon's protections. Almost half of the Amazon is under some form of federal protection, including 22%, which belongs to indigenous peoples. He sees this as an impediment to national growth. He is creating this tired dichotomy of we need to destroy forests to spur economic growth, that environmental protection is essential, or I'm sorry, the lack of environmental protection is essential to spurring economic growth, which is absurd because the very agribusiness sector that is pushing him to enact these rollbacks are reliant on the Amazon to create the rainfall that drives Brazil's economy, that drives the agricultural export economy of Brazil. But he will continue to use these tired, outdated, and destructive arguments to undermine environmental and human rights protections that keep the Amazon standing, precisely because it's doing a service of the short-term profit of these industries, be it agribusiness, be it mining, be it infrastructure development, which is driving the process we see today. It's very much behind the fires. It's behind the spike of 67% of legal deforestation in the Amazon that is also fueling these fires. And this is not a process that started 3 weeks ago when the fires first started raging. This has been going on for a while, but Bolsonaro, with his destructive and toxic rhetoric, is driving it to extents we haven't seen in a generation. It's truly harkening back to Brazil's military dictatorship, which really oversaw the wanton destruction of the Amazon rainforest and the genocide of its indigenous peoples.
Yeah, $20 million is not enough. You're talking about short-term and long-term solutions to this catastrophe, you say. What needs to be done immediately and in the long term, apart from a pledging of money, for example, for what we saw with the G7? What needs to be done in the immediate and in the long term to ensure that something happens to preserve the Amazon?
Absolutely. Well, obviously, the fires are a pressing concern, and the international communities that come together to provide the resources that the Brazilian government apparently needs to address this crisis. But I mentioned also what the Brazilian government needs to do is restore the human rights and environmental protections that are so essential to the Amazon's ecological integrity. And it's only going to do that if it understands that it's jeopardizing not only its reputation internationally, because I consider this government is creating a sort of a pariah state, at least in terms of environmental issues in Brazil. Yeah. But the international community needs to make it clear that we're no longer going to patronize Brazilian businesses and industries as a result of the fact these industries are very much behind, unfortunately, this destruction we're seeing today. So the long-term solution is that Brazil understands, that the Bolsonaro regime understands that it's going to lose critical market share. It's going to lose money and economic growth as a result of its wanton behavior. And it will therefore feel the need to suppress its worst intentions, moderate its behavior, and very much take care of its duty, not only to Brazilian people, because this is a Brazilian issue, first and foremost, but to the world, to uphold these protections. Because if we do not uphold these protections, what we're going to see is further destruction. These fires are foretelling far more destruction, and we can't afford that on this planet.
And the G7 also agreed to support, a reforestation plan to be unveiled in September. Would that go a long way, just very quickly, Mr. Poirier?
Absolutely. I think reforestation is important. Brazil has a commitment to reforest 37 million hectares of forest under the Paris Accord, which it is flagrantly disregarding right now. So Brazil has already gone on record or signed an agreement that it'll do that itself. But it does need international support to do that. Let's get together and support Brazil's efforts to do this work, to do the important efforts to restore the forests in the Amazon that are so essential. Because even though we can't restore the forests that we see burning today, the incredible biodiversity and ecological integrity of these forests, we need to nonetheless begin a process of healing this destroyed landscape, this scorched landscape.
All right, thank you very much for your time there. Amazon Watch Program Director Christian Poirier talking to us, of course, about the nearly 80,000 forest fires which have been detected in Brazil since the beginning of this year, calling on world leaders, of course, to intervene. And that we saw some reaction to that from the G7 summit. But, of course, Poirier saying that's not nearly enough.